Let me start with something that most people completely miss. When an avoidant man chooses another woman, he usually does not begin by announcing, "I have chosen someone else." He begins by creating distance, and that distinction matters, because if you are only listening to his words, you may be completely confused by what his behavior is telling you. You might notice that the conversations become shorter. The enthusiasm disappears. He stops asking questions about your day. He becomes less interested in your thoughts, your feelings, your plans. Maybe he used to initiate contact, and now you are always the one reaching out. Maybe he once wanted to know where the relationship was going, and now every conversation about the future seems to make him uncomfortable. And you start asking yourself, what happened? Did I do something wrong? Did I become less attractive? Did I say too much? Did I ask for too much? Stop there, because this is where you have to separate your worth from someone else's emotional availability. An avoidant pattern is often driven by a desire to regulate emotional closeness. When intimacy begins to feel overwhelming, complicated, or demanding, distance can become a psychological strategy. That does not mean every distant person is avoidant, and it certainly does not mean every withdrawal proves another woman exists. But when a man is emotionally transitioning towards someone else, increasing distance can become one of the clearest behavioral signals that the relationship is changing. And here's the philosophical lesson. People reveal their priorities through repeated behavior far more reliably than through isolated statements. He can tell you, "I'm just stressed." He can say, "I need some space." He can tell you, "Nothing has changed." But if for weeks or months his behavior consistently says, "I am no longer investing here," you have to be courageous enough to observe the pattern instead of clinging to the explanation, because hope can become dangerous when it's being used to negotiate with reality. You see, many people make the mistake of responding to emotional distance by increasing emotional effort. He pulls away, so they text more. He becomes colder, so they become warmer. He stops initiating, so they start carrying the entire relationship. He becomes uncertain, so they try to prove that they are worth choosing. But think about what that does. You are essentially taking responsibility for a decision that belongs to another human being. And that is where self-respect begins to disappear. You cannot love someone into emotional readiness. You cannot communicate perfectly enough to make another person choose intimacy. You cannot become so impressive, so patient, so understanding that someone loses the freedom to make their own choice. If he is choosing another woman, your job is not to defeat her. Your job is to understand what his behavior is telling you. And there is another subtle psychological shift that happens here. When an avoidant begins creating distance, you may become hyper-focused on every little signal. You analyze the punctuation in his texts. You notice how long he takes to respond. You study his social media activity. You replay conversations in your mind. You start searching for clues because uncertainty activates the brain's need for closure. But the more you chase certainty from his behavior, the more power you give his behavior over your emotional state. That's why you need a higher standard. Don't ask only, does he still have feelings? Ask, is he behaving like someone who is willing and able to build a relationship with me? Those are two completely different questions. Someone can have feelings for you and still be unwilling to choose you. Someone can miss you and still not be capable of giving you consistency. Someone can care about you and still decide to walk in another direction. And that is painful, but it is also liberating. Because once you understand that, you stop trying to decode every emotion and start evaluating reality. You stop chasing the man who is creating distance. You stop competing with the woman he may be moving toward. You stop treating his withdrawal as a challenge you have to overcome. And you begin to recognize the deeper truth: your value was never determined by whether he stayed. Sometimes the most powerful response to someone's emotional withdrawal is not to pull harder. It is to stand still, observe clearly, and refuse to abandon yourself. Because when someone creates distance to choose another path, your greatest power is not convincing them to turn around. It is having the strength to keep moving forward without them. Now, once that emotional distance begins, something else can happen that is even harder to recognize. He starts comparing the relationship without necessarily admitting that he is doing it. And understand this carefully. When I say comparing, I'm not saying he necessarily sits down and creates a list of everything you have and everything she has. Human psychology is far more subtle than that. Comparison often happens emotionally. It happens through perception, through contrast, through the way one relationship makes a person feel versus another. He may begin thinking things feel easier with her. Maybe she does not ask as many questions. Maybe she does not challenge him emotionally. Maybe the connection feels newer, lighter, or less complicated. And suddenly, the relationship he has with you begins to feel heavier. Not necessarily because you are demanding too much, but because intimacy with you requires him to confront parts of himself that he would rather avoid. This is where you need to be very careful. Do not automatically conclude that the other woman is better than you. That is one of the most destructive stories you can tell yourself. Because when someone chooses another person, the mind wants a simple explanation. She must be more beautiful. She must be more interesting. She must be easier to love. She must have something I don't have. But relationships are not mathematical equations where one person receives a higher score and wins. Sometimes people choose what feels familiar. Sometimes they choose what feels emotionally safer. Sometimes they choose what demands less vulnerability. Sometimes they choose novelty because novelty temporarily produces excitement without requiring the depth that long-term intimacy requires. And if you understand that, you stop turning another woman's existence into a verdict against yourself. The avoidant dynamic can make this particularly confusing because emotional closeness may activate conflicting desires. A person can want connection and simultaneously fear what connection requires. They may crave intimacy when it is distant and then retreat when it becomes real. So imagine what happens when another woman enters the picture. Suddenly he may experience a psychological contrast. With you, there is history. There are expectations. There are unresolved conversations. There is emotional accountability. With someone new, there may be none of that yet. Newness can feel like freedom because nothing has been tested. But remember this, ease is not always evidence of compatibility. Sometimes ease simply means there has not yet been enough intimacy to expose the difficult parts. That is why you should never compete with the fantasy of another relationship. You are seeing the reality of your relationship with him, while your mind may be imagining the highlight reel of theirs. You don't know what happens behind closed doors. You don't know what emotional patterns will eventually emerge. You don't know whether the new relationship will actually provide what he believes it will provide. And frankly, you don't need to know, because your healing begins when you stop making his comparison your competition. Think about the philosophical implication here. If your identity depends on being chosen over another person, then your identity is permanently vulnerable. There will always be someone younger, richer, more attractive, more outgoing, more agreeable, or simply different from you. But if your identity is rooted in knowing who you are and what kind of relationship you're willing to accept, comparison loses its power. You don't need to be better than her. You need to be aligned with yourself. That means you stop asking, what does she have that I don't? And you start asking, what do I require from a relationship in order to feel respected, secure, and genuinely chosen? That question changes everything, because the goal is not to convince an avoidant man that you are superior to another woman. The goal is to become so grounded in your own standards that his comparison no longer determines your emotional worth. If he chooses another path, let him walk it. Your responsibility is not to win the comparison. Your responsibility is to become incomparable by refusing to measure your worth against anyone else's choice. And once that comparison has taken place internally, another shift often begins. He becomes more detached, not necessarily because every feeling has disappeared, but because emotional distance can become a way of avoiding guilt, discomfort, and accountability. This is where people often misunderstand what they are seeing. They think, if he is acting this cold, he must never have cared. Not necessarily. Human beings are capable of caring about someone and still behaving in ways that hurt them. That contradiction is one of the most difficult truths about relationships. Feelings do not automatically produce mature behavior. A person can have affection, memories, attraction, even genuine attachment, and still choose avoidance when responsibility becomes uncomfortable. For someone with strong avoidant tendencies, emotional conflict can be especially difficult. If he knows that he is disappointing you, knows that you want answers, and knows that his attention is moving somewhere else, he is confronted with an uncomfortable psychological reality. Whatever he chooses, someone is going to experience pain. And instead of facing that pain directly, he may create more distance. Why? because distance reduces emotional intensity. If he talks to you, he has to see your reaction. If he explains himself, he has to confront your questions. If he stays emotionally engaged, he has to acknowledge the consequences of his decisions. But if he becomes cold, vague, or unavailable, he can temporarily escape that emotional confrontation. This does not make the behavior healthy, and it does not excuse it. Understanding a behavior is not the same as approving of it. That distinction is critical. You can understand why someone withdraws without chasing them. You can understand their fear without volunteering to be hurt by it. You can have compassion for their emotional limitations without making those limitations your responsibility. And this is where your own psychology becomes important. When someone suddenly becomes detached, your instinct may be to pursue clarity. You want to talk. You want to explain. You want him to understand your perspective. You want him to tell you what changed. But sometimes the more you demand emotional resolution from someone who is actively avoiding emotional discomfort, the more they retreat. Then a cycle begins. You pursue. He withdraws. You pursue harder. He becomes colder. You become more anxious. He becomes more distant. And eventually you are not even fighting for the relationship anymore. You are fighting for an explanation. That is a dangerous place to live, because closure does not always arrive in the form of a perfect conversation. Sometimes closure comes from accepting what someone's repeated behavior has already communicated. And let me give you a principle that can save you enormous emotional energy. You do not need someone to confess their true feelings before you are allowed to respond to their behavior. If he consistently withdraws, you can acknowledge the withdrawal. If he stops investing, you can acknowledge the lack of investment. If he chooses another relationship, you can accept the reality of that choice. You don't need to hate him. You don't need to demonize the other woman. You don't need revenge. You need clarity. Because the mature response to rejection is not self-destruction. It is self-definition. You say, this is what he has chosen, and now I get to choose what I will do with that information. That is power, not controlling him, not making him jealous, not waiting for him to regret everything. Power is refusing to allow another person's emotional limitations to determine your identity. And maybe one day he realizes what his distance cost him. Maybe he doesn't. That part is outside your control, but your response is not. You can walk away without becoming bitter. You can care without chasing. You can remember without returning. And most importantly, you can understand his detachment without mistaking it for a measurement of your worth. His withdrawal may explain his limitations, but it never defines your value. And then you reach the point where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. He stops fighting for the connection. Now, understand what I mean by that. I am not talking about one bad week, one argument, or a temporary period where someone needs space. Relationships have difficult seasons. People get overwhelmed. Life happens. The issue is the repeated pattern of investment or the absence of it. When a man has emotionally chosen another direction, one of the clearest changes is often that he stops participating in the work required to maintain the relationship. He stops initiating difficult conversations. He stops trying to repair misunderstandings. He stops making meaningful compromises. He stops asking, how do we fix this? And eventually, you notice something painful. You are carrying the emotional weight of the entire relationship by yourself. You are the one reaching out. You are the one trying to communicate. You are the one suggesting solutions. You are the one wondering how to bring the connection back to what it used to be. And at some point, you have to ask yourself a question that requires enormous courage. Am I fighting for a relationship that the other person has already stopped choosing? Because love cannot survive indefinitely on the effort of one person. One person can initiate but not sustain mutuality. One person can apologize but cannot create reconciliation alone. One person can communicate but cannot have a genuine conversation with someone who refuses to participate. This is where many people become trapped. They believe that if they just try harder, become more patient, communicate more perfectly, or give the other person enough space, the relationship will eventually return to what it was. But sometimes trying harder does not create connection. Sometimes it only hides the fact that connection has already become one-sided. And there is a psychological reason this can be so difficult to accept. When you have invested deeply in someone, your mind does not want to believe that the investment may no longer be reciprocated. You begin looking backward instead of looking at the present. You remember how he used to call, how he used to look at you, how he used to make plans, how close you once felt. And you compare today's relationship with yesterday's relationship. But yesterday cannot negotiate with today. The person you fell in love with may have shown you genuine affection at one point. That history can be real while the current reality is also real. Both things can exist. He may have cared then. He may care in some way now, and yet he may still be unwilling to continue building the relationship. That is why you must judge relationships not merely by their emotional history, but by their present behavior. Ask yourself, is this person showing up? Not, did he once show up? Not, could he show up? Not, what if he changes? Is he showing up now? Because potential is not partnership. Promises are not partnership. Memories are not partnership. Consistent participation is partnership. And when that participation disappears, your responsibility is not to compensate for it indefinitely. You have to stop confusing persistence with love. Sometimes persistence is courage, but sometimes persistence is fear. The fear of accepting that something you desperately wanted is no longer available. There comes a moment when strength means putting down the rope, not because you stopped caring, because you finally started caring about yourself. And if he has chosen another woman, let his choice belong to him. Do not chase him into a decision he has already made. Do not negotiate for a position in someone's life that should be freely offered. Let behavior speak. Let reality speak. Let your standards speak. Because the relationship you deserve is not one where you constantly convince someone to participate. You should never have to carry a relationship that requires two people to survive. And this brings us to one of the most confusing behaviors of all. Sometimes a man can choose another woman and still try to keep you somewhere in his orbit. This is where people become emotionally trapped because the signals appear contradictory. He says he wants to move on, but then he checks on you. He becomes distant, but occasionally sends a message. He stops investing in the relationship, but suddenly appears when you begin pulling away. He may watch your stories, react to something you post, ask mutual friends about you, or send a casual, "How have you been?" after weeks of silence. And immediately, your mind starts building a story. Maybe he regrets it. Maybe he still loves me. Maybe he wants me back. Maybe choosing her was a mistake. But you have to slow down, because attention and commitment are not the same thing. This distinction can save you from months or even years of emotional confusion. A person can miss your presence without being prepared to build a healthy relationship with you. They can be curious about your life without wanting to participate in it. They can feel jealous at the thought of losing access to you without actually being willing to choose you. Human beings have a complicated relationship with loss. Sometimes we don't fully appreciate access to something until that access disappears. And that is especially important when you're dealing with someone who has a pattern of emotional distancing. When you stop pursuing, something changes psychologically. The pressure disappears. The person may suddenly feel safer approaching because they no longer feel that emotional demand. Your absence creates space for curiosity. But curiosity is not commitment. That is where you need discipline. Because if you interpret every small signal as evidence that he is returning, you can become addicted to breadcrumbs. One message gives you hope, then silence. Another message gives you hope, then distance. A like on social media gives you hope, then nothing. And suddenly your emotional life is being controlled by tiny fluctuations in another person's attention. That is not freedom. That is emotional dependency on uncertainty. And the deeper problem is that intermittent reinforcement can be incredibly powerful. When attention comes unpredictably, the brain can become even more focused on receiving the next signal. You start checking your phone. You analyze timing. You interpret emojis. You wonder why he viewed something but didn't message. You are no longer living the relationship. You are studying the possibility of the relationship. And there is a massive difference. So if he reaches out after choosing another woman, don't immediately ask, "What does this mean?" Ask a better question. What is he actually offering? Is he offering clarity? Is he offering consistency? Is he taking responsibility? Is he communicating a genuine intention? Is he prepared to make a different choice? Or is he simply checking whether the door is still open? Because if the only thing he wants is access to your attention, you have to decide whether that access is healthy for you. And this is where boundaries become an act of self-respect. You don't have to punish him. You don't have to ignore him to manipulate him. You don't have to post things designed to make him jealous. You simply stop rewarding ambiguity. If someone wants a place in your life, they need to communicate that clearly and demonstrate it consistently. You are not a backup plan. You are not emotional insurance. You are not a source of validation someone can return to whenever another relationship becomes uncomfortable. And if he genuinely wants to return, let his actions carry the weight of that decision. Do not do the emotional labor for him. Do not translate vague messages into commitments. Do not turn curiosity into love. Do not turn nostalgia into reconciliation. Because you deserve something far more powerful than being missed. You deserve to be chosen. Never confuse someone's desire to keep access to you with their willingness to truly commit to you. And now we arrive at the part that matters most. Not what he does next, not whether he regrets his decision, and not whether he eventually comes back. The real question is what happens when he has to live with the consequences of the choice he made. Because every choice has a consequence. Sometimes the consequence arrives immediately. Sometimes it takes months. Sometimes it takes years. But eventually, reality catches up with every decision. When he chooses another woman over you, he may initially experience relief. There is a new relationship, new attention, new chemistry, and perhaps the feeling that he has escaped the emotional complexity of the relationship he left behind. But novelty can create an illusion. A new person has not yet accumulated the history that makes a long-term relationship difficult. There are no years of unresolved arguments, no established expectations, no familiar patterns of conflict. Everything can feel lighter because everything is still untested. But eventually, every relationship reaches the point where novelty fades and reality begins. And that is when a person has to confront something deeper. The problem they thought they were escaping may have been partly within themselves. If an avoidant pattern involves pulling away whenever intimacy becomes uncomfortable, changing partners does not automatically change the pattern. A different relationship can provide a different environment, but it does not necessarily create a different emotional capacity. That is a crucial distinction. You can change the person beside you without changing the patterns inside you. And eventually, those patterns tend to reappear. The same discomfort with vulnerability, the same desire for distance, the same fear of emotional dependence, the same impulse to withdraw when expectations increase. And if he has not done the internal work, he may discover that the new relationship does not magically produce the emotional peace he imagined. But I want you to hear this carefully, because this is where people make another mistake. They wait for that realization. They sit there thinking, one day he will understand what he lost. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. You cannot build your future around somebody else's potential regret. That is still allowing him to control your emotional life. Your freedom begins when his realization becomes irrelevant to your healing. If he regrets it, that is his experience. If he misses you, that is his experience. If he realizes that you were more valuable than he understood, that is his experience. Your responsibility is to decide what you do with yours. And this is where loss can become transformation. You may have entered the relationship believing that your greatest goal was to be chosen by him, but perhaps the deeper lesson is learning to choose yourself. Not in the superficial sense of repeating positive affirmations while secretly waiting for him to return. I mean genuinely choosing yourself in your decisions, choosing peace over emotional chaos, choosing consistency over potential, choosing reciprocal love over one-sided effort, choosing reality over fantasy, choosing dignity over desperation. That is a profound psychological shift, because once you stop asking, how can I make him realize my worth? You begin asking, why was I ever willing to negotiate my worth in the first place? That question changes the entire game, and maybe he comes back someday. If he does, don't evaluate his return by his words alone. Evaluate the transformation behind those words. Has his behavior changed? Has he developed greater emotional responsibility? Is he capable of consistency? Is he willing to communicate? Is he choosing you freely, clearly, and without keeping another option waiting in the background? Because returning is not the same as changing. Missing you is not the same as being ready for you. Regretting the loss is not the same as becoming capable of sustaining what was lost. And if he never comes back, your life does not become a failed love story. It becomes a lesson in self-respect. You learn that another person's decision can hurt you without defining you. You learn that rejection can redirect you. You learn that sometimes losing someone is not the end of your story. It is the moment you stop abandoning yourself to keep someone else. So let him live with his choice. Let him discover whatever that choice teaches him. And you keep becoming stronger, clearer, and more intentional about the life you are building. Because the ultimate victory is not watching him regret losing you. The ultimate victory is reaching the point where you no longer need him to. So let me leave you with this. When an avoidant man chooses another woman over you, the natural reaction is to ask, why wasn't I enough? But that is the wrong question. The better question is, what is this experience teaching me about what I am willing to accept, what I truly deserve, and who I am becoming? Because his choice is about his life, his emotional capacity, his priorities, his patterns, his decisions. It is not a measurement of your worth. Maybe he pulled away. Maybe he compared the relationship to something new. Maybe he became emotionally detached. Maybe he stopped fighting for the connection. Maybe he still tried to keep a door open after choosing someone else. And maybe someday he realizes what that choice cost him. But none of those possibilities should determine what you do next. You cannot build your future around the hope that someone eventually regrets losing you. You cannot spend your life trying to become so valuable that someone finally understands your value. You have to understand it first. And that means accepting a powerful truth. You should never have to compete for a place in the life of someone who genuinely wants you there. Love is not supposed to be a constant audition. You should not have to chase consistency. You should not have to decode silence. You should not have to convince someone to communicate. You should not have to compete with another woman for basic respect. And you certainly should not have to abandon yourself just to prevent someone else from abandoning you. If he chooses another path, let him. Not because you are bitter, not because you want revenge, not because you are pretending you never cared. Let him because you finally understand that love without reciprocity becomes self-abandonment. And if he ever comes back, don't ask only, does he miss me? Ask, has he changed? Because missing you is easy. Returning is easy. Sending a message is easy. What matters is whether he has developed the capacity to communicate, commit, take responsibility, and consistently show up. And if he hasn't, then his return changes nothing. Your life is not waiting for his realization. Your future is not dependent on his regret. Your worth is not determined by the woman he chose. You are allowed to grieve what you wanted. You are allowed to miss what was beautiful. You are allowed to acknowledge that something mattered to you and still decide that it is no longer healthy for you. That is maturity. That is strength. That is self-respect. So stop asking, how do I make him choose me? Ask instead, why am I still trying to be chosen by someone who has already shown me what he is willing to give? And when you can answer that honestly, something inside you changes. You stop chasing. You stop comparing. You stop waiting. You stop interpreting every signal. You stop measuring your value through another person's behavior. And you begin choosing yourself, not as a strategy to get him back, but as a commitment to never lose yourself again. Because maybe the greatest lesson was never about getting the avoidant to come back. Maybe the lesson was discovering that you can walk away from someone you deeply wanted and still walk directly toward the life you deserve. He may have chosen another woman, but you still get to choose yourself, and that choice can change everything.